I call the honourable member Ian Lees-Galloway.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And I would like to echo the thoughts of Dr Hutchison in regards to the officials and the submitters at the Select Committee. This was a challenging piece of legislation. There is a range of balancing acts to be achieved in this legislation, and we drew at the Select Committee heavily on the advice of officials and the large range of submitters who appeared before us as well, and thank them for the time they took to work with us. Mr Speaker, this is an attempt, and I think a very good attempt, to secure consumer safety whilst balancing the scientific view with the traditional view with regard to natural and supplementary products. And I think we've done well to achieve that. It would be remiss of me not to recognise that on the one hand, we could have done this, I think we've now figured out, actually more like 7 years ago. It goes back to 2006, when Tony Ryle played politics with this piece of legislation and withdrew the National Party's support. We could have made progress. We could have secured consumer safety all those years ago, but National, as they so often do, preferred to put politics ahead of healthcare and the good and the well-being of New Zealanders. And that point was actually raised by a number of the Select Committee submitters, the submitters who came to Select Committee, because they actually felt duped by the National Party. As much as I disagreed with their position that there was no need for this legislation, I could understand why those submitters felt that they had been duped by the National Party, who said one thing in opposition and then did completely the opposite thing in government. And those submitters came to Select Committee and they said there is no substantial difference between this legislation and what had been proposed by the Labour government back in 2006. And they pointed out the hypocrisy on display from the National Party regarding this issue. They came and said, Mr Speaker, we do not understand how the National Party could have held that view 7 years ago and be progressing this legislation now that they are in government. But nevertheless, Mr Speaker, I happen not to agree with those people. And the Labour Party has been consistent in that approach. We didn't agree with them in 2006 and we don't agree with them now. We think this legislation is important. And it's great that we have broad support across the House for a sensible regulatory environment for natural health products. Because I appreciate the statements made by a number of the submitters that natural health products, and actually I like the new title. I don't know when we're actually going to refer to this bill with the new title, but the natural health and supplementary products industry. I appreciate that it is a low-risk industry in that the products themselves are low risk. Where I see the great risk, and I know the Minister touched on this as well, is when people choose a substance for which there is very little scientific basis to support the claims made around that substance over a more mainstream medical approach. The risk there is that they may not be getting the appropriate treatment for the ailment they have, or they may in fact be putting themselves at greater risk by avoiding using something that we know works and using instead something for which the either the scientific or the traditional evidence basis has not been established. And that's what this bill does. It says if you're going to put a product on the market and make a health-related claim associated with that product, you have to provide evidence, whether it be scientific or traditional, that this product does what you say it will do. And there is still an element of consumer choice here. There is still an element of consumers having to accept a level of risk, because consumers will have to look at the type of evidence available and they will have to consider whether they want to follow a scientific approach or a more traditional approach, and that is people's individual choice, and that has been accommodated for in this legislation as well. There is one particular aspect of the Select Committee report that I would like to refer to, and that is the advice that the Health Select Committee received from the Regulations Review Committee regarding Henry VIII clauses. Those are clauses that empower the executive to override primary legislation with regulations. Sorry? Henry VIII did die a long time ago, that's true, but nevertheless we still call these things Henry VIII regulations, such as the sometimes anachronistic nature of Parliament, Minister Bridges. We agree that it is dangerous in the health sphere to allow the executive to override with regulation policy established by Parliament in legislation. Particularly dangerous, I think, to let the current Minister of Health wield that power, because we know that Tony Ryle will always put politics ahead of health. And the idea that Tony Ryle would have the power to override legislation in order to gain or to make a political point or to achieve some political point scoring, we just can't trust that man with that kind of power. So I agree with the advice from the Regulations Review Committee that Henry VIII clauses are not ideal, and we have to ensure that this legislation and the regulation established by this legislation cannot be overridden by the executive with regulation. Mr. Speaker, this bill is well past its time. It's well past its due-by date. It is a pity that it has taken, like the Medicines Bill, an awfully long time to come back to the House, but I think actually one of the reasons for that was the desire to align the Medicines Bill and the Natural Health Products Bill, because of course they actually belong together in a single piece of legislation that could have been passed back in 2006. But it's good to see these bills being progressed in this extended sitting hours time, a time for non-controversial legislation that has the broad support of the House. Once again, it's just a pity that the National Party insists on putting politics ahead of healthcare and consumer safety, and that this was not done in 2006 when it should have been.
I call the honourable member Mojo Mathers. Tēnā koe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Green Party is extremely pleased to be supporting this bill.